Hey, family.
Hola.
We got a guest in the
dias.
studio.
Yes, we do.
Hey.
Very special guest.
This is Hallie.
Hi.
I'm not going to reveal too much personal information unless you want to, but she is a high school student here, observing, obviously.
It's a lot to
Right.
learn.
It's a lot to handle. But she'll be part of this with us. Encourage her. High school students rock. We've been using all of our awkward jargon with her.
That's right. And we sound super cool. We're fitting in.
Yeah.
We're on fleek.
That's
Oh,
right.
yes.
We're trying not to be Visco girls.
Yeah, no.
And I, oops.
Yeah, I like that.
No.
She's not a Visco girl
No,
either. We've
I'm
established
not.
that. Not
Or
at all.
TikToker.
You're not on TikTok?
Ooh, see? That's
Yeah,
tight.
me neither.
We know what that is.
Yeah.
TikTok, yeah.
You're like a
Remember,
bunch
you
of-
forgot?
No, I know TikTok. My kids are on TikTok. All right, we got to talk about a justice issue today. This one's pretty interesting. We started it on the radio, but not enough time to cover it, so we thought we'd bring it to you. The basics are this. Oklahoma, on Monday, took part in what has become the largest mass commutation or reduction of sentencing in United States history. This even supersedes what President Obama did to federal prisoners, where he released 330 federal prisoners his last day in office. This is bigger than that. 462 Oklahoma State inmates. This was done unanimously by the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, the governor, and the people of Oklahoma, because in 2016 what happened was they passed referendums in Oklahoma that made simple drug possessions a misdemeanor instead of a felony. So it changes sentencing. And they raised the threshold for which other property crimes are felonies. So things like theft, vandalism, shoplifting, and robbery used to be a certain dollar amount would become a felony. They raised it to $1,000. So in theory, somebody could steal $999 and not get a felony. It's the $1,000 that becomes the threshold, or threshold, depending on how you say it. I said threshold, which sounds like a wrestling
Thrashing
move.
people.
Sounds like a wrestling move. Like an elbow drop or something. So they did this, and the governor loved it, thought it was criminal justice reform, a good thing. What do you think? Is this something Christians ought to cheer for? The commutation of 462 inmates? Because here's how this works, right? So that the people decide our punishments are too harsh. We shouldn't call these certain crimes, drug possession, theft, robbery, these certain things, felonies. So they cheered for themselves and did it. Now what do you do with the people in jail for drug possession that shouldn't have been in prison based on the new guidelines? Oklahoma did something where they go, well, here's how we fix that. All of you are in prison right now, no matter what your sentence for these crimes, if you fit under the new guidelines, you're out. Get out. You can go home now. Good move. Are you cheering for this, Christian? I almost gave the phone number.
Yeah.
Which would not be helpful at all.
Really weird. Hi, Callie and Mike. Good morning, guys. So we have some text that came in regards to this conversation we started. Hi, Teresa. Good morning. Someone said, my son was sentenced to 6 years for a crime he committed 1 month after his 18th birthday. He is 41, and the felony still won't allow him a decent job. He is not the same person, but is yet treated as if he was. I agree it should be reconsidered.
Yeah, this is one of those where I think the idea of crime and punishment is considered, I think, among Christians kind of a fringy
Yeah.
thing. Like, prison ministry is not fringy. It's noble. The guy that goes in, like your father-in-law does this.
Yeah.
And goes and ministers to people in prison.
Right.
We love that. I mean,
Right.
the Bible says, remember those who are in prison. As if you're there with them, okay?
Right.
But I think the idea of justice and injustice when it comes to sentencing and crime is fringy for Christians.
Why? What is it that's
I don't know.
that we find difficult to work with there?
I'm not sure, but I think part of it is we really like the Old Testament standards of very black and white crime. This is the crime, this is the punishment. This is the crime, this is the punishment. And yet, the principle from Jesus is mercy. Justice and mercy. Remember, like he looks at the Pharisees and he yells at them and he goes, listen, what are you doing? You're worried about tithing the tiniest bit of mint from your garden, but you're neglecting the greater things.
Yeah.
Justice is one of the
Right.
ones he mentions.
One of the amazing things, obviously, about the cross is that it's the one place where justice and mercy meets.
Okay, explain.
And well,
I agree with you. I just love that. I want to hear more.
mercy in terms of we didn't get what we deserve. That's what we love. That's the gospel. Yeah, that's awesome. But we forget that justice is there too. The sin was paid for.
Jesus just paid for it for us.
He paid for it. So it wasn't like, oh, okay, cool, we'll just brush it aside, I forgive you. It was dealt with by somebody else. And I think part of our issue is we want to make sure, when you say justice, we want to make sure people get what they deserve. Like, we don't know, I think as a church, we don't know how to balance the two, mercy and justice.
Because I want you to get what you deserve, but I want mercy.
Exactly.
That's how we always think, right?
Exactly.
We'd rather have mercy for ourselves, and we're grateful for it, but we want you to have justice.
So I think as Christians, as we approach this topic, I think we need to figure that out amongst ourselves first. You know, how do you handle the conversation? How do you approach people that have committed a wrong and extend mercy and justice at the same time? Like making sure, I want you to be punished, but I want it to be fair. You know, where does it end? For example, that man carrying something he did 18 years.
Yeah.
You know? Mike says if you break the law, you should be punished based on the law at the time you did it.
No mercy from Mike.
Adrian says
But what if
society
no,
is...
but I mean, seriously
yeah.
though, Mike, let's just say that you got a bag of weed. Not you, obviously. But let's say you got a bag of weed. And 20 years ago, that would give you 20 years in prison. Today, it would be, you stop that. Give me that weed. Which, in some cases, that's the situation, right? Really? We shouldn't let the guy out that's rotting in prison? Really? I don't know if that's justice, is it?
Dan says you cannot have mercy and justice unless you're willing to serve their sentence.
I don't know. What I'd love to deal with is this tension point, right? What does the person do when we look at, let's just say, somebody is in jail for vandalism equaling $900, which would have been a felony in Oklahoma before. Now somebody else goes into court for the same crime. It's a misdemeanor. They're given no prison time. We should leave the other guy in jail when our standards in society have changed.
I don't see why. Maybe
I don't see why that's justice.
I don't understand that.
That sounds
And
unjust to me.
Part of why I'm going there is if we think about why did we change our minds? Is there something we are understanding about the crime that makes us look at the punishment differently? So when you consider that, then how can you then look back and look at the people sitting there and say, no, but you stay there?
And they're like, but wait, you don't think this is a problem anymore.
Exactly. That's where I'm going. Exactly.
Yeah, but it's not our problem. You shouldn't have broken the law.
Back then. Like, you broke it at the wrong time. It was harsher back then than it is now. Mike says of course the judge could give mercy, but by giving mercy, too many people will allow people to take advantage of it. And it snowballs.
Okay.
Paul says, I think once you serve the punishment, the charges should be dropped. The individual should be accepted as a normal person.
Well, and I think that relates to the idea of felony shouldn't follow you as part of it.
Yeah, and I know that's another conversation, but how much of that is true, though? Seriously.
Well, because we want it to follow child predators.
Exactly.
I do. I want my kids to be protected.
Exactly.
I don't want them to suffer the rest of their lives and never get a job. And I think they're redeemable, and spiritually speaking.
Spiritually speaking.
By the way, this is Hallie, if you're just joining us. She's a high school student here in Northeast Ohio. She's amazing. She's hanging out with us today.
Super smart, guys.
We're just about to get all the answers from Hallie. So.
That's right. She's just waiting.
Yep.
Listen to all the old people.
Yeah,
argue about
exactly.
it.
Christy says, what if there was another way, a lesser sentence prior, is now a harder sentence today? Should we recall all the people back to serve the harder sentence? What do you think?
I understand how that feels parallel, but I don't think it's parallel. Because we're talking about people who are unjustly in prison, releasing them versus, we've already let them out. Now we change our mind, we're going to throw them back in. That feels very different to me. Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because the payment for their crime is finished.
Yes.
The person who's paying for a crime they committed that we've changed our standards on is not finished paying for their crime yet.
And sitting there. Oh my gosh.
I think it's different. I understand your point, but I don't think that's the same.
Sarah says, "Good morning, Brian, Janelle. We're on the same time." By the way, Sarah is in Ecuador, people, right now. We're on the same time again now. Yay! So, in short, I think this change is fantastic. Social reform or change rarely happens immediately or completely. This is a great first step to righting criminal justice that several callers have mentioned. You have highlighted in the past the great difference in sentencing between Caucasians and people of color. This needs to be addressed, and I see this new law in Oklahoma a good start. That's something you highlighted at the end, Brian,
Yeah,
the difference in demographics, and some people won't like hearing that, but it's the truth.
But that tends to be the sad reality. And Ed Stetzer wrote on this. You want to read about it, because Ed Stetzer indicated that in the 80s, he was a proponent of the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
That what we should do with people on crack, because that was the big thing, crack cocaine in the 80s, is take them and throw them in jail.
Yeah.
And that was
Yes.
primarily an urban black problem,
Yes.
crack cocaine. Even if you look at the sentencing differences in the 80s between crack cocaine and heroin, the form of it, the crack cocaine was much more prominent in black neighborhoods.
Right.
And that carried a much harsher punishment in larger, or in smaller amounts, comparatively speaking. But today, if you look at the heroin epidemic, okay, so heroin's illegal, it's a drug, and if someone takes it, we kind of, as a society, go, oh, poor person's addicted
Yes.
to drugs. We got to help them.
Yes.
And so I think that we almost have this retroactive moral obligation to say, and Ed Stetzer did this. He said, I confess to you, in light of the heroin epidemic and my response to it, I was wrong in the 80s. But if that's the case, if there's someone still in jail from that, shouldn't they be let free and put in rehab? Like, I feel there is some sort of injustice done when we discover errors. I'm not saying we're going to be perfect, but I guess I'm that guy.
Yes. Teresa says, unfortunately, the person is probably a worse person now because they spent that amount of time in prison.
That is part of the problem.
Yeah.
And that's why we have recidivism rates
Yeah.
so high. It's because we aren't even, because that's a whole other issue with prisons. Should prison be a punishment? Or is being in prison punishment enough? And we should just reform people while they're there.
Yeah.
There's people who want old chain gangs again. Chain them up, put them in striped outfits, and just smash boulders all day.
Wow.
I think being separated from your family personally,
Yeah.
and living in a concrete place, I think that's punishment enough.
Yeah.
Just me.
Teresa says, I believe all of this goes back to how we can't know a person's heart. Is someone worthy of trust? Are they remorseful?
No, we can't know. No, that's true.
Yeah.
What else we got?
Callie was hearing on the broadcast, someone sent a private message and was just talking about a ministry that helps with what you were saying, recidivism or training people back. That's the issue, is the opportunities you steal from someone and the consequences, lifelong consequences. Callie says, what if jail or rehab doesn't work? What's the next step?
I don't know. Which is why perhaps judges need a little bit more leeway. Oftentimes their hands are tied by mandatory minimums. But I think what's changed my heart on this is not just my wife's advocacy on some of this, but it's also the more I grow in close to Christ, I think the more I see how undeserving I am of salvation, how much of a disaster I am.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the more I lean on Christ's mercy. And one of the consequences for that, for me, is in my everyday life, it's pushing me on the mercy side of the scale.
Yeah.
I don't want to remove punishment, trust me. There's consequence. I mean, there's consequence for sin, in spite of the fact that we're saved. But I tend to, since I need mercy so badly from the Lord, I tend to lean towards mercy with others.
Yeah.
It sounds wimpy, but I don't deserve, I deserve hell.
Yeah.
I deserve justice. And justice was done not by me, but through Christ. You see?
What do you think about the other part of the law with theft, vandalism? Like, why that change and why is that important? Why should we cheer for that?
I think it's hard for me to judge. This comes to motive again, right? It's hard to judge the heart. Now, if someone goes and robs a bank for $10,000, it's probably greed, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with the person who steals a shirt because they're cold? Or the family who doesn't have any food to eat, so they shoplift. You know, you hear the stories all the time. We cheer for cops who catch someone shoplifting, find out the reason was because they're hungry, so the cops buy their food, not arrest them, right? In some sense, this law change is like that. They're saying, look, if you're below $1,000 worth of something, maybe there's something else going on here that we don't know about, and we're going to give you some benefit of the doubt. But we don't want to do that in society. We want to throw the book at people.
Yeah. And then people, it just feels like people who are already down, now on top of that, you're going to not just load up prison time, but here's a felony that's going to follow you. So now if you couldn't get a job or were struggling, now you really won't be able to get a job. You know, it's just...
Does the story change if your son or daughter was one of the 462?
Is it okay to ask Mike? Like, Mike?
Yeah,
Mike, would your story change, or your opinion, if it was your son or daughter who was one of the inmates that were let free last Monday?
and that's one of the questions we have to ask, which is why I like when people call to share their story, because it's not just a number, it becomes, oh, they're a Moody Radio family member. They love Jesus. Their kid loves Jesus. I'm so glad their kid was released. This is great. But when it's a number or a crime, we don't see the humanity of the people behind it.
Yeah. Eva says, I don't necessarily agree with the taking away accountability for people's actions. However, I think consequences should be the same across the board. Money or no money, lawyer or no lawyer.
Yeah.
Eicheen says, unfortunately, looking at today's world, it's usually a worsening for the inmates in mind and spirit, or slap on the wrist privilege. The law isn't perfect either, given that we're not bound to the laws of Leviticus, blood offerings, etc. But despite that, there's a time for consequences and a time for mercy. People in our culture as a whole change, motives change, despair drives people to do things. Life is strange.
Yeah, and that points to the complexity of this, because I don't want to be an advocate of grace abuse either. Like, there is consequence for sin. And I don't think if someone steals, they should be free of consequence.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And you can't steal. It's not only a sin, but it's law. But what they're doing in Oklahoma is changing the severity of the consequence.
Yeah.
When you transition from felony to misdemeanor, you're talking about a change in the consequence.
Do you think that would make it easier for somebody to say, oh, cool, now I can rob and get $500? You know, some people could worry about that. When you got severe consequences, then it makes people say, man, I really don't want to do this.
I'm not a person who thinks that anyone who's committing a crime is weighing the consequence in that moment.
Or even knows about
Let's
it.
see, the state of Oklahoma just changed the threshold,
Yes.
so I'm only going to take $900 worth of... No.
Yeah.
Does changing the speed limit from 65 to 70 encourage people to speed?
I don't know.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Well, somebody might speed now, though, Janelle.
Right.
I think we overestimate the power of fear of consequence motivating behavior.
Yeah.
Like, even for me, like, if my family is desperately hungry and we have no money, I don't care. I'm stealing from my wife and kids so they don't starve to death. Sorry. Lord, forgive me. Right? Isn't that where we all would be?
Yeah.
And I would take the consequence for it.
Mike says, I believe life is hard. If a child chooses to break the law or commit a sin and they get punished, they have to suffer the consequences. It may be hard, but I would say the same about myself. If someone is innocent and they get punished, that's different. Mike says, does ignorance of the law come into play? You know what, though? But when we get into the way that the law, the differences in terms of how it impacts different demographics, that's hard to listen to. Because, when you're on the heavier side of the law and then you look at, like, how it's not evenly applied, and then you're experiencing the consequences, then you look at the ramification of how it impacts certain communities. It's hard to just say, it's not that simple to just say, well, life is hard. You if you break the law, you get punished. It's not. Like, you're only in the position to say that if you don't experience the injustices of the law.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you could
Yes.
say, well, yeah,
Well said.
that's the thing. It's just hard to hear that. Because I don't know if I would be able to say that, but my experience of the law is different. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I just find it interesting that folks who look at in a broad sense, criminal justice reform and sentencing, they don't look at the consequences of that for those already in prison.
You're right.
I wonder if some of the resistance, now I'm not going to give you my opinion on this, but I've always often wondered about some of the legalization of drug discussion is slow to come about because people don't want to let people out of jail. They want to keep them there. And they know that if we as a society decide something's no longer as big of a deal as it used to be, we've got the moral problem behind us of people in jail for those same crimes. I don't know if we want to let those prisoners free because I don't know if we like them all that much.
Yeah, it's true. Mike says, as a parent, sometimes we punish a child and they don't agree, but we have to do what we think is right for that child. I've done it. Do we go back down then?
I have had times where Sarah and I give a consequence to my child, and we talk about it, and a day later we lessen the consequence because we decide that punishment wasn't appropriate. You ever done that?
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
we
yeah.
had a time where I told my son he's going to lose his phone for a month. And I thought about it for about 12 hours, and I was like, well, that's outrageous. So I went back and I lessened his sentence.
Yeah.
Because in hindsight, I decided that was not just. The punishment didn't fit the crime. Why couldn't society have the same right, in a sense, to do the very same thing?
Even the same heart.
That's what happened in Oklahoma.
Yes.
The people agreed that, wow, we're too harsh on these crimes, let's lessen them. Oh, wait now, we've got to deal with the people who were sentenced
Still
under that.
sitting in there. Yeah. Robert, good morning. Robert says, 2 children take the same cookie. One is yelled at, and the other is put in punishment for 3 months. Is that fair? Mike, the judge knew both sides of the story at the time. We only see the surface issues. Oh.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I think there are times though when judges don't know the whole thing.
And we're talking about pattern. These aren't isolated issues. This isn't a problem, like a pattern. If you look at the last 40 years, right, and the way laws in the war on drugs have been applied. Mm-hmm. So it's not just, oh no, this is a case the judge knew. It's a pattern in the criminal justice system. Mike says, I agree, Brian, because that was a rash punishment. What if you thought about it for a day and then back down? Sarah says, I'm glad that some states are fitting punishment for the crime. $999 is roughly 3.5 weeks of full-time work at a minimum wage in Oklahoma. Should a lifelong felony follow someone who could work off a theft debt through community service? Drug laws are a little more complicated, needing interventions and rehab programs.
See, that's what I'm talking about. That's a deeper dive on what does justice truly look like. She's essentially saying 3 weeks of work could work it off, but what we're doing is we're having them be punished for the rest of their lives.
Right. Rod says, knowing that firm corporal punishment waits for the culprit has been a prime factor for shaping young boomer behavior to obey the law. Thoughts, Brian?
I've heard that argument before, that one of the reasons for the increasing prison population is that kids today aren't punished with corporal punishment enough. They need just a good whooping and they won't commit crimes. Some kids need a good whooping. I bet Len has said that before.
Yeah, but it don't work.
But
yeah,
we still had rampant, horrible crime in the past as well. Like Charles Manson wasn't a criminal because he wasn't spanked.
Yeah.
So like I think a lot of things have changed, but when you do the research about what happened with prison population, the prison population exploded with the war on drugs in the 80s. I mean, exploded.
Yeah.
The war on drugs filled America's prisons.
Yes.
And that's that's like factually accurate. And so if that's the case, I don't know that we're going to say that lack of spanking caused that when it looks like what changed it was our sentencing for drug crimes.
Yes. And are the same people who are saying, no, they need to stay in there. I wonder what the language is about people using drugs today. Heroin, you know?
We feel bad for them.
We feel bad.
In
yes.
fact, we all need to have some Narcan around just in case they overdose so we can help them out.
Exactly.
In the 80s, it was like, good, you shouldn't take drugs,
Exactly.
you're dead.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Sarah says, while the Bible defines sin, do not steal, each country defines the degrees of definition, burglary versus robbery versus armed robbery. While we must submit to the authority of our government as it applies to the law, we can also be open enough to admit that our justice system is created by a broken man. We should be willing to allow for change. We could theoretically compare this to slavery in the 1800s. Eventually, we had to realize that slavery was wrong, and we took steps to rectify it. We can't return time lasts to those who were liberated as adults, but we can rejoice that the moment our children could live in freedom. Rod says there will always be the defined deviance.
But back to Sarah's point.
Yes.
I think one of the required readings for followers of Jesus has to be, especially in America, Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Dr. King. Because did you read that in school?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. See, I didn't read it in school.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't read it till just a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was game changer for me because it's a theological treatise on the idea that it's not an unbending truth that you honor government authority. It helps us understand in a modern context that God's authority always supersedes government authority, and we're not called, like if the government says do this and it's unjust in God's eyes, we don't do it.
Right.
So,
Like
as in
right.
Jim Crow laws.
Yeah.
And
1800s, if you found a like a runaway
Runaway
slave, you went to jail if you couldn't help him.
That's right. And it was illegal for African Americans to eat at a white lunch
Right.
counter.
Right.
And that was not just in God's eyes. And so what Dr. King did through his civil disobedience was say, I'm not going to obey this law because it's unjust. I'm going to honor government. Notice nobody fought back or hurt anybody in that nonviolent context. And they submitted. They went to jail. Dr. King wrote that letter from jail. He accepted the consequence, but he protested the law itself, saying that God's law is more important. And in this case, that to me indicates that we as Christians are supposed to be called to look at laws and justice in society. And we don't just blindly follow government, assuming everything they've done is God ordained. It's not true. We are called to evaluate it, and where justice is not being done, we are called to advocate for its change. And I think Dr. King, when you read the letter, especially if you read the editorial beforehand, did you have to read his letter from a Birmingham jail was predicated by an editorial written by 7 clergy in Birmingham that basically told him to go home.
Yeah.
And when you read that and then read his letter, it was a game changer.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm glad they're requiring that for reading in school. I'm actually disappointed it wasn't for me.
Yeah. Well, I had to.
You had to read it, but
Yeah.
it was good.
It was really good.
And it's not that long.
No.
It's a letter, it's not a book.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts?
That was very long-winded, sorry. That was passionate.
Final thoughts?
It's worth talking about.
Oh, yeah.
If it were easy, I think we'd have clear answers, but all I know is there is that tension you pointed to at the cross of justice and mercy. Mm-hmm. And we need to live in that tension.
Yes, we do.
And not only blindly advocate for justice for those who do wrong, but also mercy for those who do wrong.
Right.
And appropriate punishment.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, guys, for tuning in. Remember, Dave Safransky tomorrow, Dr. Julie Slattery.
Oh, yeah, I gotta turn it off.
Every
Special
day.
thanks to Hallie. Hallie's the best.
Yeah.